morning, everyone, again, and delighted to be here to share the findings of a research report that Dr. Pauline Cullen in Maynooth University and I developed on behalf of the National Women's Council earlier this year. So just in the weeks before and after the 2024 local elections. And it really, that research builds on earlier work we had conducted following the 2019 local election, where we had surveyed at that point all incoming new and also previous incumbent councillors, both men and women. This time we surveyed outgoing women councillors and prior to the most recent local election. So the research is based on their personal experiences and their perspectives, but it also provides this really unique insight into the challenges and opportunities for women in politics 5 years on, in addition to looking at policy changes in the landscape. So since 2019, initiatives like women's caucuses, maternity leave for women politicians, hybrid working, and a number of different mechanisms and measures have been put in place in an attempt to advance women's representation in politics. The research also provides a preliminary gendered assessment of the 2024 local elections, so kind of a statistical assessment of retention, attrition and turnover with reference to candidate selection and electoral competition, in shaping the outcomes for women in all of their diversity in local government. And what our analysis reveals, and this would have also been illustrated by research or a post-election analysis undertaken by organisations like Women for Election, See Her Elected, is that there has been stagnation in women's representation at local level. And we conclude that real structural reforms are needed to meaningfully advance gender parity in local government. So just to give you some historical context, relative to their share of the population, women have been grossly underrepresented in local politics, as they have been in Dáil Éireann, as I'm sure most people know, and particularly women from minority and marginalised backgrounds. It's very welcome that in the 2024 local elections, that 52% of newly elected councillors of a migrant background are women. But despite the fact there was 3 traveller women on the ballot in 2019, there was no traveller women candidates at all in 2024. And that really underlies their continued exclusion from local office and from the floors of our democracy, essentially at local level. Rachel noted overall there was a slight increase in women's representation on the ballot. So the number, or the percentage, should I say, of female candidates increased from 28% to 31%, including, as I said, 50 women from migrant backgrounds, translating into 52% of those councillors. But there are very significant trends and differences by political affiliation, by group membership, and also by geographical context. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael won the highest proportion of seats, but they both failed to select at least 30% women candidates, and their proportions of women councillors are relatively low, at 21% for Fianna Fáil and 27% for Fine Gael. Women accounted for 1/5 of independent candidates and councillors, including 13 migrant women in rural Ireland, but none of those women, unfortunately, were successful. The election also reinforced this urban-rural divide we have seen really since the foundation of Irish democracy, where urban areas and suburban areas tend to be much more gender balanced, relatively speaking, often than rural areas. And there are rural councils with very, very low proportions of women councillors at the moment. Data produced by our colleague Dr. Adrian Kavanagh, Maynooth University, also shows that retention is gendered. There was 132 councillors who decided not to contest the local election. And of those, 39 or 30% were women. But what is interesting is that a higher proportion of women in 2 categories. So if you look at those who were elected in the 2019 local election, and if you also look at those who were in the outgoing cohort, so i.e. these would have been women who may have been co-opted after that election, in both those categories, the percentages of women deciding not to run again were higher than was the case for men. So there are are real gender trends really across the system, and there's a lot more, I think, statistical research to come on this election. We're not done yet, and many lessons to be learned. There is also a very clear trend in this election that incumbency suppresses women's political representation. An incumbent, of course, being a current or outgoing office holder. And we know that incumbency is gendered, and it's gendered in two ways, as this election reveals. Firstly, most incumbents are men, because of the gendered imbalances in political representation. So they tend to disproportionately come through candidate selection procedures, but they also have an advantage at the polls with voters. Data compiled by Women for Election and See Her Elected, again, reveals the gendered effects of incumbency. And I suppose just to note you to the stat in the first couple of bullet points, that it really is best to be a male councillor and it is worst to be a female non-incumbent. So that is quite telling. Preliminary assessment also shows of this election that women attracted fewer first preference votes. And there is some data to show that they were recruited by parties to essentially act as sweepers for male running mates. And that is evident in the number of women who were successful, but successful on very tight margins. There were a number of cases across the country where women won their seats, but on very late in the count and on very small number of votes. And there was also a number of women losing on small margins too, but very transfer friendly. So that again will come back to parties and party strategies, and we can unpack that in the Q&A if people are interested. I suppose it's important to say too at this point that incumbency has implications, losing elections, should I say, particularly for an incumbent, has implications. And we know from research elsewhere, there are gendered costs to losing, both psychological, financial, and political. And we also know that though when women and men lose elections, they tend to persist equally. But that the margin of loss matters for recontesting. So research from international research shows that if women lose on very large margins, and if they have children, they're less likely to recontest for election than men who have a similar family, in a similar family situation. So this is complex, but is worth, I think, investigating. So what we did in our research is we undertook a survey of all outgoing women councillors as of April 2024. So we conducted the survey 6 weeks prior to an election. So as you can imagine, our response rate wasn't huge, but we did get a 16% response rate, which is actually 38 women. And of the women who did respond, most of them gave us very rich qualitative data. And you can see in the report, we have allowed that data to essentially speak for itself. We give a lot of quotations, and we really just give women the space to share their own experiences. So despite the low response rate numerically, the research is indicative, and it really does give us really valuable insights into the dynamics of women's political representation in Irish local government, including why some women chose to run for re-election, why others decided not to run in this election. It reveals, as I've mentioned, their experiences of being women in local office and how gendered that can be. And we have a lot of data on various kind of aspects of the local role. And it also, as I've mentioned, elicits their views on recent government initiatives to promote women's equality in Irish local government. Just very briefly to profile the participants, a majority had served as a councillor for 5 years or less. So they were a relatively new group of women responding to this survey, which is quite interesting actually from a methodological point of view. Maybe they felt that more that they had a greater reasoning maybe to respond, or maybe they had just been sent fewer surveys in their time. But nonetheless, they were a relatively new group. 29% had served for between 6 years and a decade, and the remaining women had been in office for over 11 years. And one woman said she had been in office for 2 decades, a local government service. 2 women had previously lost their council seat at a prior election. 63% had won their seats in the 2019 local election, and the other 37% had been co-opted in the period following that election. The majority identified as white Irish, and that would be indicative of the lack of diversity in Irish local government in relation to elected office holders. They had caring responsibilities, and the majority were in paid employment elsewhere, whether in full-time or part-time employment, or running their own business or consultancy service. We asked about co-option and the experiences of co-option because in the prior survey in 2019, we'd asked about their views of candidate selection and how they had navigated that process. And of course, women who had been co-opted wouldn't have gotten that survey. So we felt it was important to do this again. Co-option has been a really important pathway for women into local office in the past 5 years. In actual fact, over 50%, so 52% of those co-opted to local government since the 2019 local election were actually women. So we can see that parties were using this route to try and rebalance the slate to some extent. So what we found of the small number of women in this survey who gave us some qualitative data who have been co-opted, in general, there was a positive view of the process. They felt they had been relatively supported by their parties. And the first quote here is quite indicative. This woman says, "I felt my local party and HQ were keen to identify young women in particular, and they were strong of me in that encouragement," when her initial reaction was to say no. So it's a lot there around supply and that old saying of having to ask a woman numerous times before she will feel that she's able to run. And that still stands quite firm in this research. Having said that, the last quote also shows that there is a need for uniform induction supports for co-opted councillors, both women and men, to help them to find their feet when they are in this situation. So this quote says that she gathers that the induction process for newly minted councillors post-election was very variable, and there was even less hand-holding available for new members during the term. And the research myself and Pauline conducted for the NWC back in 2019 would have found, and these were newly elected councillors at that point, we would have found very, very similar findings. So there is, I think, a learning there for stakeholders. In terms of retention, so as I mentioned, we asked women why they were running, and we also asked those who weren't running why they had made that decision. In relation to those who were running, we asked them about the influences and what supported them to do that. So their enabling factors, and several themes emerged here. A really prominent theme was that they really were concerned about women's representation. They wanted to ensure that women's representation was maintained or even advanced in their local council. And they were quite concerned that if they didn't run, that there wouldn't be other women to replace them, as that first quote says, and that would be quite a representative quote actually across the sample. Other women spoke about being role models for their community and their own children, wanting to contribute to community work and wanting to see projects to completion. And what is quite clear is that women, despite the very real challenges, have a very deep commitment to local public service, and they characterise council work as satisfying and a source of confidence building and personal fulfilment for them. Factors encouraging women to run again included having a support system at home. Nothing new there. We've known that for quite some time. How care poses a disproportionate burden on women in public office, and also the capacity to I suppose, make a change on issues that they care about. And some incumbent women also said that they wanted to promote their party and they wanted to prepare for the next general election. And of course, local government is the key pipeline into the Dáil. So if we don't solve gender imbalances there, that will cause real problems for us in future general elections. There is absolutely a pragmatic reasoning there for women too. And some of those quotes, as you've seen there, will really emphasise those key themes. In terms of why women weren't running again, they cited multiple reasons for their decision. Including the increasing demands of the role of a local councillor, how that has changed, become more demanding, and how that made their career progression very difficult outside of the council, how it created real work-life conflict for them and their families, so negative impact on family life, family planning for women planning or thinking of having children. We also it was a very prominent theme was the issue of low remuneration for councillors that necessitated this second job and that then exacerbated time poverty with implications for time spent on self-care and with their family members. Other women spoke about online abuse, in-person abuse, the need to maintain this local profile. You're constantly in touch with people, having to constantly be available to people on multiple platforms. But there was also a theme of slowness of local government, that political decision making and the limited powers of local government meant that it was very difficult sometimes to get things over the line or to get things progressed. So as we conclude in the research, they could holding local office granted them access to decision making, but not necessarily to real influence. And that represented, I suppose, an ineffective use of their time. And one of the reasons why that they had gotten involved in politics to begin with, which was to make change, was not always possible for them. But again, that remuneration really stood out for us as a really clear finding, and we have some recommendations there. And these quotes will also speak to that. Abuse, online and in-person abuse of women in politics has become very prominent as an issue, and particularly since the publication of the task force on the safe participation of in public life just prior to the summer a number of months ago. In this small but nonetheless insignificant sample, 2/3 of the sample reported online and in-person threats, harassment and intimidation. And what is really key here or notable is that 42%, again, this is only of 38 women, but 42% had considered leaving office as a result of this behaviour. There was a sense and a very strong view that women from minority and marginalised groups were particularly impacted by this. And you can see the first quote here. One woman said that she had approached 8 women to run for the last local election, and all were put off by what she described as the coarse and harsh nature of the political arena, which she felt was very real. There was also a view shared, or the experience shared, that there was could also be challenges at a council level itself. So inappropriate behaviour or a breaching of professional boundaries between male councillors and their female colleagues, as that last quote describes. And this woman in particular mentioned, that there was a need for a system to complain where a male councillor behaves in a matter that would not be tolerated in any ordinary workplace. And that is an important point to note, I think, that councils, though we don't often think of them in this way, are workplaces and operate to the same gendered norms as other places and require the same level of protection and policy that is too often missing. And that really, I suppose, was the next theme of ours. So we asked councillors more about the gendered nature of the role. A number of themes cropped up here. The first was that women felt that hybrid working had been really, since COVID, had been very impactful in a positive way for women, members of minority groups, and also for those with care responsibilities to be able to balance all of their various commitments. And that was quite prominent. However, they did caution about the lack of networking and visibility that comes from in-person meetings. So there was kind of a thread throughout that women felt, yes, this should be maintained in a post-COVID world, but that it is necessary to keep, I suppose, in-person meetings, particularly for the most important issues like budgetary meetings, but also for that networking piece to ensure that those who are online don't lose out on other opportunities. And I think we probably know that from all of our own workplaces and not just local government. And there are some quotes there you can see that speak to these various themes. The last participant spoke about the struggle to get male councillors to appreciate the issues of care and the logistics that undermine their experiences of the council. And there were other quotes. That the third last one says, the council allegedly is part-time. However, in my council, meetings can be scheduled on any day. And what that means, even if I have part-time childcare provision, meetings can be scheduled randomly outside of those times. So again, a very common theme about councils as gendered workplaces that advantage certain people and disadvantage others. We asked about maternity leave because since the last survey, in 2022, legislation was enacted to allow for women councillors to take a form of statutory maternity leave for the first time. And some of these women who responded to our survey had either availed of that, or they had quite strong opinions on it one way or the other, as in it being part of I suppose, the target cohort. In general, it was noted as helpful, but given the very competitive dynamics of office holding in Ireland and local authorities and political parties' lack of experience of managing and supporting maternity leave, it did raise other issues for them. The first quote was very positive. She was in the first cohort of councillors to benefit from that legislative change, and she used the temporary substitute option, so she could have a temporary someone step in for her for a period of time. And during the leave, she had the full freedom to care for her baby without worrying about missing key issues or items. The other two quotes, though, were more on the challenging side. Giving leave doesn't address the competitive disadvantage of absence from duties and the expectations of local office. Another participant said she was currently going through the application process and it's a nightmare, so no, the admin support is going to be impossible to actually use. So we do have some recommendations about how this may be better streamlined and more supportive of women. So our final theme was just to ask them about what other options or mechanisms or measures should be implemented to try and advance women's representation locally. Again, these are the key target group, right? These are the women who have been through it and they know what is required. There was very strong support for local election quotas, so for a statutory quota to be implemented in line with what we currently do for elections to Dáil Éireann. So 3/4 of the sample advocated for gender quotas on this basis. And you can see the quote here where one of the participants, to take an example, argued for quotas tied to public funding and also felt there was a need for special mechanisms for wider diversity and more inclusivity of minority groups, including travellers, people with disabilities, migrants and people of colour. We also asked about caucuses, women's experience of caucuses. So they have become very popular. Vast majority of councils either in the outgoing councils either had a local caucus or a regional caucus where caucuses had come together in cases of low numbers of women. And most women who were members found that these were positive initiatives and they wanted to see them re-established post-election. So that quote there, one woman in particular said she has seen them work really well in other councils and think they can be very effective once party politics are left at the door. And there are some learnings in the report from the caucus experience. So finally, just to conclude, it was quite clear from the research that holding local office for women is challenging, and particularly for women from minority and marginalised backgrounds. And many women underlined the gendered push factors that led them to exit from politics, that really reinforced their decision not to run again. And that is a great loss to our democracy. We lose experienced women when women decide to exit. However, and despite those challenges, women councillors affirmed their commitment to local public service, and that was illustrated by the record number of women who contested for the local 2024 local election, and also by our findings, which there was a real sense of not just commitment, but almost resilience despite the challenges. So you can see some quotes here, and we could have selected from any number of quotes. I mean, we had so many women tell us this. The first quote, "I love the work. I love supporting my community, being a positive influence, advancing positive change." The second participant viewed the 2024 local election as a litmus test of what she achieved in 2019 and wanted to see how she did. So again, speaks to that confidence building piece, and she had work to do locally. The last quote said that she just loved helping her community, and she also importantly didn't want the far right to take hold in that community, and that was a real impetus for her to run again. So I won't go into these in detail, but just for your information, in the report you can find online, we have recommendations split into two themes. One is on pipelines to local office, so increasing the proportion of women candidates, but also supporting greater supports for candidates when they do run, including financial supports and supports around care, and tackling online abuse and in-person abuse and harassment. And we also have a series of recommendations about doing local politics. So how do we start to dismantle some of that the very real gendered challenges for local office holders once in office, and how, particularly for those with care responsibilities. But also we have recommendations around funding for caucuses, work-life balance for councillors, and very importantly and critically, increased funding to properly resource and support women's community organisations and the broader community and voluntary sector, where of course women are overrepresented, unlike in local office where they're underrepresented. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. That's brilliant and a great scene setter for the next part of this morning's session. So we're going to stop the recording now.